started thinking like the colonists to know the true Ali. Started dropping it. The problem is we started thinking like the colonists to know the true Ali. Started dropping.
Noble Drew Ali was sent on a mission back to America, where he was from, to teach the Moorish people their true heritage. And he taught that there were Moors in America before there were what we know as Native American Indians, and that this history has been obscured and robbed. And it's not only robbed the so-called black people, it's robbed the white people. It's robbed everybody, because the knowledge is what's lost, you know. And it's almost, you have humanity enslaving its best, you know, taking the best part of itself and cutting it off.
Drew Ali, he grew up in North Carolina. His parents, he had Native American blood. He passed away. His parents passed away, and he grew up with an aunt in New Jersey. He had dark skin.
Mm-hmm.
And he had paranormal abilities, and he's a very gifted individual. So in his very young man, I don't even think he was 19 at the time, he's either stowed away, I think he was supposed to have joined the circus at one point, and also have stowed away on a ship and gone to Egypt, where when he arrived in Egypt, he came upon a group of initiates, mystery school initiates who were expecting him and greeted him, and they basically gave him a task, which was they blindfolded him and took him into the Great Pyramid. I believe they took him to the King's Chamber, and they said, okay, here you are, now find your way out. Now, the initiate doesn't necessarily make it. Now, keep in mind, when you're going over to Egypt, you're not dealing with all the, child labor laws and issues of safety and protocols that we have built into our society in America. It's, it's kind of a no man's land in some respects in Egypt.
Wow.
But so anyway, he obviously did this of his own will, but they blindfolded him, put him in the Great Pyramid, and the attitude is, good luck, you might never survive. I think it was 4 days later, they found him between the paws of the Sphinx. The implication was that he got there, not by crawling out of the pyramid, but by crawling underneath a complex of caves and tunnels and ended up between the paws of the Sphinx.
They found him. He got out of him almost immediately. They were surprised, and they found him between the paws of the Sphinx. And the paws of the Sphinx are very symbolic. It's the cradle of knowledge. In many ways I can tell you, which we won't go into.
Any case, they found him, and he had passed the test. Now, finding him between the paws of the Sphinx is very symbolic, and we won't go into the symbolism of that because it kind of might digress from. But it showed that he had a great deal of enlightenment. I mean, the Sphinx being the riddle of mankind. He was told the true history of the Moorish people at that point by these initiates, and that America was Almaricanos. We got the name America from Almaricanos, not from Amerigo Vespucci, and Almaricanos means El Morocco, and that Morocco was the Sultanate of Morocco was the ruler of America at one point. Now,
wow.
This goes back into a very deep history.
He also knows that North America is known as Al-Maghreb Al-Aqsa.
Of course, I know that. North America was known as Al-Maghreb Al-Aqsa, and it reported to the Sultan of Morocco.
The Constitution is their sanction to do business at Morocco. There's that business flag of amity and commerce. Now you understand why you have that Moorish flag, and then you have the stars and stripes. It's a banner. It's not the national flag. This is the national flag. It's your history. You're standing on your own land, trying to go to Africa, and you're standing on Africa.
And he was here. He came back to America to teach the so-called black people, which were really of Moorish descent and heritage, their true heritage, and that this whole stuff about African slaves, I mean, look, there were a lot of slaves brought over from Africa, don't get me wrong, but this was not where all the black people came from. There were black people of Moorish descent here in America. This is why we have cities like Cairo, Illinois, Memphis, Tennessee, and Alabama was either called Ali Bamu or Ali Baba.
Right.
And all of these names, Alexandria, which might have had a more, and so there's a lot of history is a charade that we've been told, and there's the story of which I brought out in my book Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, the story of George Washington and the chopping down of the cherry tree. The Moroccan flag was the red flag, the red standard. It was called the cherry tree because it was red. Originally it was pure red. They later put a green saber on it or a green pentagram on it to distinguish it from maritime red flags. But it was originally red, and it was called the cherry tree.
Now, it is a great Masonic secret that has long been revealed that it was George Washington who chopped down the cherry tree of the Moors, erasing them from the history books and removing their nationality, fez and turbans. It was even predicted that in a few hundred years, many of them would not remember who they were or their connection to the land.
So George Washington chopping down the cherry tree referred to the fact that the first treaty with the United States of America was with Morocco, and part of that arrangement between their diplomacies was that Morocco had sued America during the Revolutionary War because they were enslaving their people. The Sultan was so they sued America, and America did not respond. So Morocco started taking hostage American ships hostage, and this resulted in a diplomatic squabble, which eventually was settled with the first peace treaty of the United States of America.
It was Morocco who supported and gave rise to the independence of the United States of America, as it has been recognized by President Obama.
The first nation to recognize my country was Morocco. In signing the treaty of.
And of course, Barack Obama has to know about the Moors because he's from Chicago. And I'm told that even the white people in Chicago know about the Moors because they have a very strong presence in the parades. So there will be some, knowledge of this. And, this is what the Seventh Seal is. I wrote it, and I'm just researching this stuff on my own. I'm not being prompted to do it.
And part of that settlement was that Moorish citizens, going back years, hundreds of years in some cases, should be released. And all they needed to do was go to the president, go to the White House and say, I am a free Moorish national. Let me go. And they would be freed from bondage.
Moorish Americans are indigenous to America.
The problem with George Washington is not that he didn't recognize it, was that he didn't announce it. He didn't make it known. He obscured the fact even from his own slaves. He didn't tell them, we made a deal with the Moroccans and you can go if you're a Moorish national. And so this is George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. And this is a part of history that we're not allowed to know. And Noble Drew Ali was here to teach people this.
Moorish Americans are indigenous to America.
But there's another important thing, and one of the most troubling aspects of the legends and as well as the history of Noble Drew Ali, was that he was at a Pan American conference in Havana, Cuba, where all of the dignitaries, state diplomats from all countries of the world, particularly Pan American countries, gathered to, and he was shown a mandate, which basically showed that the America was the rightful possession of the Moors. And this mandate was so powerful, and I believe it was showed to him by the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State of America saw it. But after this conference in 1928, all of the European countries pulled their money out of America because they saw that America was risky, because the true corporate shenanigans of the entire country were being, and the sovereignty of America as it stood was being threatened by the presence of Noble Drew Ali and this mandate. Now, we've never been able to turn up this mandate, but what we do know is that after that conference, there was a stock market crash because of this, and then the entire country was reorganized and reincorporated, and you had all this FDR coming along in the 1932, and the Admiralty Court superseding the regular United States Constitutional Court, and the taken off of the gold standard. So there was all this, and United States of America becoming a corporation, and all these sort of sleight of hand legal manipulations, which is not my expertise, but you can study them, and they certainly exist. And this was all as a result of the presence of Noble Drew Ali in this world.
And he was very popular in the 20s. And he was so popular, he became quite a problem to the government, because he was lifting the black communities up, and in a way that they weren't used to being lifted up. He wasn't using Christianity.
And Noble Drew Ali took the so-called black community by storm, because he had a background in circus, he'd make these posters, and they would, play songs at these revivals, and he was the first Muslim prophet in America. And he is the forerunner of the black Muslim movement.
Oh,
it was not called black Muslim at that time.
Now, what's interesting about Noble Drew Ali is that most people don't know that out of his death arose a man called Wally Fard. And Wally Fard has an FBI file and a very obscure lineage. Like, he seems to come from Hawaii. He might have some Polynesian blood in him. He seems to have some white blood in him. He doesn't seem to have any black blood in him. He might, but he doesn't seem to. Yet he becomes the head of this Moorish Science Temple. And then he picks Elijah Muhammad to be the head of the new reorganization, which is the church, what do they call it? The Church of Islam? The Nation of Islam. Not a church yet. Nation of Islam. So you find, when you find out about the Nation of Islam, they do know that they had Noble Drew Ali as their original founder, but they don't give him much airtime.
Exactly.
And most of the people don't know this. Even people in the Nation of Islam. The higher-ups know it. And, of course, white people don't know much about the Nation of Islam anyway. They just look at it as an antagonistic oil on their side. Most people, not all of them.
And Noble Drew Ali, and I researched this and found out, who was behind the denigration of Noble Drew Ali, because he had a lot of resistance. He was scaring the living daylights out of the then J. Edgar Hoover fledgling FBI, and they were monitoring him closely, but they were as frightened of him as they were frightened of riots that were breaking out in northern cities like Chicago and Detroit, where the black communities, Noble Drew Ali was pretty much based in Chicago, but where the black communities had enough, and they were revolting against the discrimination that had taken place. So he was a very powerful character, and he was a character of peace as well. He believed in following the Constitution, and he had a great demeanor about him and a very charismatic presence, and he was said to manifest healing and miracles.
Now, there's also I want to touch on the Amos and Andy thing. Now, there's something else that's very interesting. But the interesting thing about Noble Drew Ali is that as I begin to study him, the whole TV show, first it was a radio show of Amos and Andy, was designed to lampoon Noble Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple.
But what happened in the 20s was the Freemasons created a radio show. It was the first the only things that were nationally syndicated at that time were football games. I don't think, there were big college games. Red Grange, the days of Red Grange, I don't think they were even doing baseball nationally syndicated at that point. But it was football. The first nationally syndicated series program was Amos and Andy. Spoof on these bumbling black people. But what the target of Amos and Andy was the Moorish Science Temple. Because if you go back and you watch the old Amos and Andy TV show or the radio show, they were talking about the Mystic Order of the Knights of the Sea. That's what Amos and Andy belonged to, the Mystic Order of the Knights of the Sea.
So now, my dear brothers, I say again, just as I said 2 hours ago, that now is the time that we must be alert, must be on our toes to make this the greatest. Yea, make this a year of years for the mystic Knights of the Sea. And furthermore, it is our duty. I say, and furthermore,
Boy, that was some meeting, all right. Yeah, all the brothers are going to stay up late tonight having fun. It seems, though, they all had a good nap this afternoon doing your feet.
But he was the Kingfish, and he had his Order of the Mystic Knights of the Sea. Now, that's the Moors. The Moors are the best sailors.
That was in the show?
Yeah, Order of the Mystic Knights of the Sea. He belonged to the Order of the Mystic Knights of the Sea.
And the head of the congregation was Kingfish. Pretty much anybody that remembers those shows will remember Kingfish, a highly comical character.
Hi, brothers. Well, see you at the meeting. Bye.
Oh, George, I'm going in here. The ladies' auxiliary is meeting in the clover room. I'll see you later.
Yeah, okay. Good luck, honey.
Yeah, Kingfish, I understand it's that while running for office.
Yeah, on the way the talk going, I think she got a pretty good chance of being elected to the position of Madam Octopus.
Good.
Well, she deserves it, Kingfish. After all, she's been junior assistant squib now for the past 5 years.
Yeah, now, why don't you boys go on into the ballroom? I'm going to go get myself a couple of cigars.
Oh, wait a minute. Bring me a couple, too. Bring my change.
Look, Andy, don't be flashing money like that. You'll have all the confidence men in you swarming all over us.
Oh, yeah.
And they had, like, the head jellyfish and the head mackerel, and the congregation were called sardines.
I was reading Brother Pleasant Bay's book where he gave the sardine analogy. Can you break that down, please?
Because in other words, sardines, like as example, fishermen go out and they get all the little fish, and they just steam them, put them in in cans and everything. And every fish that you see in here is not necessarily exactly the same species. So they call them sardines. After they
cut their heads off, cut their tails off, so you can't identify them.
Do you understand what I'm saying? But yet, each one of them is not necessarily the same fish. Although a lot of them swim in schools, and a lot of them are the same fish, but a lot of them are what you call just generic fish. Small schools, they steam them, called sardines, or people think they're sardines.
No such thing as a sardine,
people
right?
People who are Negro, black, and colored are classed together because it's a classification of people who have no rights. The brandings is to keep them divided from each other. Because if they all went in one direction, they would be empowered, even under a brand. Do you understand what I'm saying? Although there would be certain limited international rights, they would have power even if they all agreed to the same brand. But they don't even know it's a brand. And they don't know that the brand disallows them to inherit anything. They don't even know that they're classified as being constitutionally in a state of psychosis. There's a legal term that goes with that. I'll post that on the website. You'll see it. You understand what I'm saying?
But they were lampooning the real Moorish Science Temple, which Drew Ali had set up. And they had one episode where they had Ali Bendo, this crystal gazer who was arrested. You see? It was like they were mocking the Moorish Science Temple. Now, what's interesting is about why I said, who was sponsoring this? It turned out to be, I think it was Pepsi. And I found out I studied the whole history of Pepsodent, and the guy, it was very, I put it in the book, it's bizarre, all the connections with Pepsodent, and why it relates to teeth and whatnot. But Amos and Andy was the first syndicated show in the history of broadcasting. It got syndicated was football. You know, Red Grange and all that, those days in the 20s. Not even baseball had been syndicated at that point. It was Amos and Andy. And it was a Masonic duo that had done this. They were Freemasons, high-level Freemasons, and they created this very funny show, which was so nobody could possibly take Moorish science seriously. And black people in general would be lampooned. And if you even watch the Hollywood movies of those era, and the way black people were portrayed, even beyond the Step and Fed shit, it is just, nobody would do that now, unless they were just making fun of it, you know, Eddie Murphy or somebody. But it's like, you know, it was in such a way that white people could not take a black person seriously. And having grown up in a community where you were told that, my mother said that, no, they don't, I said, why don't black people live here? She said that they steer them away. In other words, they steer them. It was called steering. And it was just, you know, she explained it to me. And the attitudes of the people were such that, no, they weren't to be taken seriously.
And people, of course, think this is just some absurd lampooning of a ridiculous black man. It was much more than that, and it was high-level 32nd degree Masons that were doing this spoof, and they did a very good job of creating a ridiculous character. In one of the episodes, they have Stargazer Noble, or they have called him Drew. I think they call him Drew Bendo or Ali Bendo. Ali Bendo, they call him, and he's a stargazer who's thrown in jail for fortune telling. And this is shortly before, or shortly after, I don't remember which, Noble Drew Ali was put in jail. They really didn't have anything to charge him with. They did release him. There's much more. Well, according to rumors, he was beaten by the police, but that does not stand up to at least what Elihu Pleasant Bay told me, who knew one of Noble Drew Ali's wives, and he had multiple wives, being a Muslim, and he said that he was not beaten. He left. He was. I think he was supposed to go under some sort of court procedure, but because there was a lot of scandal around, people had stolen things from him and whatnot, and there was a lot of legal stuff, but he basically left his body because he said the burden on the Moorish people was too great. So he exited. He said he could do more from beyond this world. And he exited.
There was a space-time project called Ong's Hat that came in New Jersey, southern New Jersey, which is known as the land of the Jersey Moors. And Ong's Hat is an obscure location in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey where there was a experimentation of dissident physicists from Princeton, hippies, Sufis, that claimed to be operating on with somebody from the Moorish Science Temple. Now Alm's Head is part legend and part truth, but the Moorish Science Temple I'd never heard of before. But what I did know was there was a character named Peter Lamborn Wilson, there's the name Wilson coming up again, who was a member of the Moorish Orthodox Church. And the Moorish Orthodox Church was tied to Timothy Leary and the Millbrook Institute up in upstate New York. And they were kind of a CIA-affiliated church that was mocking Moorish wisdom. I say mocking. They had a certain amount of tribute to it. But I thought that this was all there was. I didn't know there was a Moorish Science Temple until I wrote this book, Synchronicity of the Seventh Seal, where I was contacted by some Moors who began to fill me in on the Moorish legacy, that it was still alive, that there was a Moorish Science Temple. These people weren't part of it. They didn't like the Moorish Science Temple. They thought that it had become institutionalized. They were Moors and they were operating outside of it. But I wrote the Seventh Seal because as I began to get a lot of, as I'm writing this information, you might say a lot of negative spirits would come to me that didn't want me to do it. Sometimes it would come in the form of media people who were ready to insult me behind my back, not on the air, but stop me from getting media appearances and whatnot. And I had to write this book to extricate myself. It was like an exorcism. And what came out of it was a very strong recognition and identification with the Moors.
The Moorish Orthodox Church was really sort of a CIA front, as far as I could, as far as I understand it. It was not a legitimate successor to the Moorish Science Temple. Now, at that point, I mean, the Moorish Science Temple exists to this day. I have friends who are a part of it. But at that time, I had no idea Moorish science had any continuation. Now, Moorish science goes back to the character you mentioned, Noble Drew Ali. And then what happened, when he left, there was a whole just horrible infighting with the Moorish Science Temple, and it was essentially destroyed. What you had was a man emerging out of this who was a very dubious man, with a big FBI file as well, Wallace Farad, or Wally Fard, as he was known. He was Polynesian-looking. He was from Hawaii, and he was the successor. But was he the rightful successor of Noble Drew Ali? No. He was the effective successor, and he had a lot of problems. He was supposedly involved with the ashram at Ong's Hat, or the land that they eventually got. That was rumor. But he was succeeded by Elijah Muhammad, who everybody's familiar with, and that began the Black Muslim movement. The Black Muslim movement, while they do acknowledge Noble Drew Ali as an earlier forerunner,
Islam to all the Moors. And let us take a moment to say that we did reach a watershed moment at Savior's Day 2014. Did you see that speech?
No, I didn't.
It's a speech worth watching because the Moors have been kicking up a lot of dust.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's look at Noble Drew Ali. Here's a man that died a young man. Noble Drew Ali. He lived from 1886 to 1929. I salute my brother. He's the first man to bring Islam to us in the way he tried to bring it. And I thank him, thank Allah for him.
So now with the internet and Facebook and social network, here come back the Moors and their teachings and all of that. So this Sunday, a couple Sundays ago, Minister Farrakhan, he did something that have never been done by a Nation of Islam leader. He put Noble Drew Ali's picture up on a big mural of all the great black leaders, and he gave him credit as being the man that is teaching Islam in America before anybody else. That's Minister Farrakhan said this. He said it, and it say in words, to paraphrase him, that this man was teaching Islam here ahead of everybody else. that means ahead of Master Farad Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad, of which in the Nation of Islam you are taught under the strict religious blinder or binder that no Islam was here before Farad and Elijah. No knowledge was here before Farad and Elijah. No disrespect, because I love me some Master Farad Muhammad, but there was some knowledge and some organizing here before Master Farad Muhammad and Elijah. And the Honorable Minister Farrakhan acknowledged that and affirmed that and praised Nation of Islam leader Minister Farrakhan, praised Noble Drew Ali, and praised the Moorish movement.
There was people before he came that belonged to the Moorish Americans by Noble Drew Ali. They didn't have this on it, the moon and the star. It was blank. It was blank. But the hat was red. They wear black ones and red ones.
Moors is the name given to the Muslims from North Africa that invaded the Iberian Peninsula and brought Islam to Spain and Portugal and southern France. So he's calling us Moors, and he dressed his followers in the fez.
So this hat here is the one that we wore at the first beginning of Muslims in the city of Detroit when Master Farad Muhammad was here, and his representative at that time, and one of the times, the first one that I seen was named Abdul Muhammad. He wore one of these too. The Messenger of Allah, he wore one, and you might see this picture sitting out there with it on. He had on one just like this, only the torso was longer. That was the first time that I seen him with the hat on, like this.
The fez that the Shriners wear is the fez of the Moors. And the tassel on its top is tied down. It was not allowed to swing a full 360 degrees because they only had 33.
I'm going to give you some hints. Some you might see don't have a tassel on it, right? What is the meaning of the tassel? What is the meaning of it? Hanging down. Well, I tell you, it means the same thing that it means when you are graduating from school. That means knowledge. This here means knowledge. Same as school, when you graduate from school. I don't know if the devil ever told a lot of our people, so many black people now is graduating, they don't tell them everything, you know, they just let them get on out of here. Yeah, you all right, you hear your diploma. And then when you come out, say, what nationality are you? Oh, I'm a nigger, I'm a Negro, I'm Afro-American. You still dumb as hell. Excuse the expression. But that's true, you know. But you got the tassel on. And don't know your name.
Look at what he said. The Moors were enslaved by reducing their mentality to that of Negroes, blacks, and colored people. As a man thinketh, so is he. Moors, you sleep too much. Wake up and see the 7 bridges crossing in the sky. Can you see that you are a people? Not an organization. We are a people. We are a nation.
It is not the Moorish Science Temple. The Moorish Science Temple still exists. They have chapters in different cities like Baltimore, up in Harlem here in New York, Chicago, and many other cities. they are not necessarily the only representation of Moors, but there are certainly the Moorish science temples. Most of my Moorish friends do not belong to the temple. They don't necessarily see eye to eye with it, but it is the Moorish movement which is important. The mandate, which we can't get our hands on, which is probably somewhere in the Vatican. It goes back to the capitulation of Granada between the Moors in 1492, the expulsion of the Jews on March 31st, 1492, and the next day, April 1st, 1492, which is effectively the first April Fool's Day. And what happens is, after the Jews have been expelled legally, they tell the Moors, you can go back to Morocco. This is in Spain. After the Spanish at Santa Fe and Granada have conquered the Moorish army by starving them out, the Catholics hated the Moors. And they said, you can go back to Morocco. We have ships waiting for you. The Moors did not believe them. When they sent people out to look, well, they were indeed ships. So the Moors went on their way to the ships, and they burned the ships on their way to the ships, and they burned their homes while they left their homes. And that was like April Fool's, ha, ha, ha. That was the first April Fool's Day,
wow,
according to Moorish legend. So this is, and there was supposedly there was a capitulation between the Moors at Granada, whereby they ceded the new continent, as it was called, and it was called in the papers. If you look at that, isn't Ferdinand and Isabella gave Columbus. It does not say Asia. It does not say India. It calls it the new continent, and he goes to explore the new continent. And they essentially had some sort of right or lease on this land, and this would be buried somewhere in Vatican archives. And Columbus is basically going there to set up the triangular trade route, the forerunner of the triangular trade route, and to enslave the Moorish nation. And the rest is history, and this is why you have all this ridiculousness that Columbus was the discoverer of America. This is utterly ridiculous to any legitimate historian. Even if they don't believe in the Moors, they know that he did not discover America and the whole history. So that's my overview of Noble Drew Ali in a nutshell. And there's a big biography, which actually Rick Smith got through me, that was sort of the life work of Elihu Pleasant Bey, who knew Noble Drew Ali's wife, and he did a vast, extensive work of the Moorish science history and Noble Drew Ali.
The reason that he died was because the burden on the Moorish people was too great. He could do more from outside of the body than inside the body.